Chewie district in Mashonaland was a place that I did not care for very much. The countryside was broken with huge, gigantic, towering rock formations, inaccessible, that reached right up into the sky, and the largest of these was an imposing hill called Banji. And if we thought that the terrain was unfriendly, the local people living in that area were even more so. This was a place where in the early stages of the war, unbeknown to the authorities, the terrorists had slipped into the country from Zambia. They had brought with them supplies, and they had taken time here to build up stocks of weapons and ammunition. And they had thoroughly indoctrinated the people to the extent where it seemed every village was in full support of the terrorist cause. And from here, the enemy had launched attacks into the neighboring centenary farming area. They had committed murder there, they had laid landmines, and they had set up ambushes. And you felt that when you were in Chewie that you could not as much as sneeze without this being reported to the terrorists. Well, not wanting the sound of our trucks to betray our movements, it was decided that we would move on foot. And so, like the grand old Duke of York's men, we marched up and down the length and breadth, it seemed, of that particular area, and always at night. And it was hard and tiring work. Well, it was a nice change for us to be told that we would be provisioned for 2 or 3 days, and that we would be removed from Chewie and taken to an adjoining TTL, and there we would be participating in a very large sweep of that tribal trust land. So we were loaded onto trucks, and we drove for many hours eastwards until we arrived at a very remote spot at an old abandoned church building that was falling into disrepair. And there we were briefed, and we were told that we would have a few hours to rest, and then we would start marching again through the night to the start line of where the sweep was to begin. And we were also told that there was an almost 100% chance that we would be meeting the enemy. The place was infested with gooks, and we were told, be prepared to fire at the slightest movement that you see in front of you while you're on the sweep line. We were also told not to concern ourselves about the presence of any local people. They would all be confined to protected villages. They'd be safe behind fences. They would not be allowed out until the sweep line had passed them by. So we needn't fear if we saw any movement that it would be locals. It would most certainly be the enemy. And so we had a few hours to catch our breath, and about 10 o'clock that evening we were mustered on the gravel road outside the church, and then we set off, marching through the night in silence. Nobody spoke, of course nobody smoked. That wasn't permitted, and all you heard was the occasional chink of a MAG belt in the night, but otherwise everything was silent. And we marched, and we marched hour after hour without a rest, and being amongst the last of the call signs to reach the start line, we had hardly paused there when the sun broke over the horizon, and it was time for us to prepare ourselves to begin the sweep. The signal was given, and everybody moved forward. The call signs were spaced about 100 meters apart, and so we proceeded. Now, this was a maneuver that worked very well for the British Army in the Boer War in South Africa. They had a fair amount of success doing this sort of thing. But I'm afraid that for us it was not a very good idea. Our army had the best intentions, but in practice it just didn't work out. We'd hardly gone a few hundred yards when we had all lost sight of each other. We didn't know where the call signs were on our flanks, and this was a matter of great concern to us. If we happened to blunder across the path of one of these call signs, or if vice versa, somebody blundered across our path, there was a very good likelihood that a shootout would ensue. And so it was pretty nerve-wracking walking through the bush with this prospect in your mind. What didn't help was that within the call signs themselves, men began to get separated and to get lost. And as we moved along, we started hearing the sounds of stragglers, and we had to be very careful that we didn't shoot our own men. And so by the time mid-afternoon came, the whole sweep had degenerated into a total shambles, and we were all assembled at an old abandoned farmhouse and took stock of the situation. Nobody had got lost. We hadn't seen one single gook. We hadn't even seen the signs of any gooks. So whatever information had started off this operation, clearly it was misfounded. Our company commanders walked amongst us, checking to see if the men were all right. We were fine, except we were tired. We had marched through most of the night. We had marched through the day on the sweep. And now, to add to our woes, my call sign, amongst others, was sent out on ambush. So again, that night, we didn't get much rest. And by the time morning came, we were really very weary. And I'm afraid that some of the men were showing signs of becoming irritable as well. It was decided that one of the platoons better go back to Chewie because the area couldn't be left entirely unattended. And so, my call sign being amongst the others, we were put onto two 4-5 trucks and told to make our way back to where we had been in Chewie. And so we set out along the tar road, which runs between Mount Darwin and Bandura, and we proceeded along it. But of course, when you're sitting on the back of a truck, and especially if you're tired and you haven't slept properly for a while, the sound of the tires on the surface of the road seems to have a magnetic and a hypnotic effect on one. You can't resist the urge to close your eyes and go to sleep. But of course you can't. Everybody must watch the bush on both sides of the road. You just cannot afford to go to sleep. But it is so very hard not to do that. Then unexpectedly, the trucks started slowing down. The one in front and then the one behind followed suit, and that certainly got us awake. When we peered along the sides of the cab and over the top of the cabs to see what the problem was. And there in the road in front of us, we found two police Land Rovers parked at right angles, completely obstructing the road. And standing beside these vehicles were a number of men in camouflage uniform, whom we assumed must be policemen. And right in the middle of the road, with his hand held up, certainly there was a policeman. He wasn't dressed in camouflage. In fact, he looked as though he had stepped out of the Salisbury charge office. And he stood there with his hand held up as though he were on traffic point duty. And, well, we had to stop. As we ground to a halt, the lieutenant stuck his head out of the window of the leading truck, and he asked what was going on. And this policeman said to him, "You can't pass here. You'll have to turn around and go back to where you came from." And our lieutenant asked him, "But why was the road blocked?" And he said, "There were terrorists seen earlier on, and the area is considered to be unsafe for travel. You'll have to turn around." Well, this created a bit of a stir on the back of the trucks. It just didn't make sense to us. This was this was the whole reason for our existence, to hunt and kill terrorists. And this man was telling us that the road was unsafe. All he had to do was just tell us how far to go down the road and leave us to get on with our job. And the lieutenant said as much to him. But this policeman was completely unwilling to listen to any reason. And he said, "I'm telling you, turn your trucks around and get out of here." Well, this was an interesting situation, I thought. I wondered to myself, who actually has the last word here? Who is in command, this policeman or our army lieutenant? And the lieutenant got out of the truck and he walked over to him. And he must have been reasoning to him, and the men were muttering on the back of the vehicles. They wanted to get home, such as it was. And we could hear this policeman was getting annoyed. And the more he was getting annoyed, the more unyielding he was becoming to any suggestion that he pull his Land Rovers off the road. Then an MAG gunner from one of the sections, a man who always was very good-humoured and good-natured, surprised us all by bringing his MAG down with a crash on top of the leading vehicle's cab. And we could clearly hear him growling loudly so that everybody could hear, "Move that rubbish out of the road before I fill it with holes." Well, this was a bit of an alarming development, and I looked to see if I could ascertain whether this man was joking, but he seemed quite serious. And I thought, this is not good. If he as much as puts one bullet in one of those Land Rovers, he'll be court-martialed for sure. But worse still, if he was to injure one of those policemen standing next to the vehicles, the whole lot of us would be court-martialed for not stopping him. And I didn't like to contemplate the idea of spending a good deal of my life down at Brady Barracks in DB. So I was just wondering, should I say something? When the policeman noticed that this weapon was now pointed at him. Well, you would think that he would wilt under the sight of an MAG muzzle looking his way. Not a bit of it. Not a bit of it. He pushed past the lieutenant and strode up to the front of the truck, and he said, "Now listen here, I'm not going to repeat myself. I'm telling you for the last time. You guys get out of here now. Turn around and go back to where you came from. You're not passing here." And I thought, now what's going to happen? But I'm happy to say that our lieutenant had a wise head on his shoulders, and he just told the policeman, "Okay, calm down." And he told the driver, "Turn the truck around," and he motioned the other truck that I was on, follow us. And so we turned around and went back in the direction of Mount Darwin. But the air was blue with curses and insults at the police. Oh, this policeman just stood there with his hands on his hips. He was absolutely defiant until the very end. And I thought to myself, well, that settles who's in charge. Obviously the cops are. But we still had to get back to Chewie. And the only way now for us to do that was to keep travelling north, right up to the edge of the escarpment, and then go westwards through the Mavuradona Mountains, along old trails that looked to me as though vehicles hadn't passed that way for years and years and years. And this too was very worrying. We were aware that we might go over landmines, that we might have to defend ourselves in a vehicle ambush. We didn't know for most of the time where we were. But the lieutenant somehow seemed to get us safely through this, and by late afternoon we were somewhere in the area of Sipalilo. We then travelled southwards, and late that evening we trundled into what was our company base there. And it was with grateful hearts and minds that we settled down, curled up in our sleeping bags, and for once had the promise of a good night's sleep. But there was still a lot of muttering about the police, even as the men drifted off one by one. And I thought to myself, yeah, even though it might only be for a few more weeks, there's no place like home, even if it is chewie.